They laughed. Loud, genuine laughter, the kind you don't expect from prisoners of war. Because on that May morning in 1944, the U.S. Army served them pancakes. With syrup. The sun was already high over the Texas plains, hot enough to bake the dust into the soldiers' boots before noon. Camp Hereford, officially prisoner of war Camp No. 31, sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by barbed wire and wheat fields that shimmered in the heat. Inside, more than 3,000 German prisoners, most from Rommel's Afrika Korps, were waiting for breakfast. They stood in lines outside the mess hall, faces blank, shoulders straight, uniforms faded to the same color as the dirt. The war in Europe still raged, but here, on the other side of the ocean, it was strangely quiet. No bombs, no guns, only the rattle of trays and the hiss of frying pans. Sergeant Tom Reynolds, the head cook, wiped sweat from his neck and shouted over the noise. "Move it, fellas. Syrup's getting cold." Private Jenkins smirked beside him. "Think they even know what syrup is?" Reynolds shrugged. "They're about to find out." The Americans had decided to serve pancakes, soft, fluffy stacks drowned in maple syrup, the kind every small-town diner in the States could make in its sleep. For the guards, it was routine. For the prisoners, it was alien. The first plates hit the tables. Steam rose from the stacks. The smell, warm butter, sweet sugar, cut through the stale air of the mess hall. For a moment, the Germans just stared. Then someone at the far end muttered in German, half laughing, half disgusted. "Süßes Essen am Morgen. Für Kinder, nicht für Soldaten." Sweet food in the morning. For children, not for soldiers. A ripple of laughter followed. Even the older officers smirked. Reynolds grinned. "You don't have to like it, boys," he said under his breath. "Just eat it. You're in Texas now." A few refused to touch the food at first, muttering about American weakness. One pushed his tray away. Another jabbed at the pancakes with a fork like they might bite back. But hunger wins wars faster than pride. The first man took a bite, cautious, testing. The second followed. A pause. Then came the surprise. One of them smiled. Just slightly, but it was enough. The laughter that followed was different this time, not mocking, but genuine. Warm. Real. In a corner, Reynolds poured more syrup, watching the room change. "Hell," he whispered, "they like it." Within minutes, the noise of forks scraping plates filled the air. The men who had once sworn to destroy America were now asking for seconds. The guards exchanged glances. Nobody quite knew what to do with the sight. Hundreds of German soldiers hunched over plates of pancakes, faces sticky with syrup, laughing like they hadn't in years. Outside, the flag snapped in the dry wind. The war felt far away, and for a moment, maybe it was. But Reynolds couldn't shake the unease. He'd seen them arrive months earlier, proud, sunburned men captured in Africa, their arrogance stripped away by defeat. Many had refused to speak to their captors. Yet now they were laughing over breakfast. He wiped his hands on his apron and turned to Jenkins. "Strangest damn thing, huh?" Jenkins shrugged. "Guess even Nazis got a sweet tooth." Reynolds didn't laugh. Something about it unsettled him. The way they laughed, not like conquerors or prisoners, but like men who'd forgotten what war was supposed to mean. By mid-morning, the smell of maple syrup hung over the camp like fog. Guards leaned on their rifles, watching the prisoners stack trays, still talking in bursts of quiet amusement. One of them, a tall blonde with a scar under his chin, approached the serving window. He hesitated, then lifted 2 fingers. "Zwei," he said. "2. Please." Reynolds blinked. It was the first "please" he'd heard from a prisoner since the camp opened. He poured the syrup without a word. Later, in the officer's hut, Captain Morgan read through the morning report. "No incidents," he said. "That's a first." Reynolds, sitting across from him, poured himself a cup of black coffee. "Maybe pancakes keep the peace," he said. The captain looked up. "You think feeding them sugar makes them friendly?" Reynolds stared out the window. The heat made the air ripple over the barbed wire. "No," he said quietly. "I think it makes them remember they're human." Outside, a whistle blew, work detail. The laughter had faded, replaced by the usual shuffle of boots and clatter of gates. Yet something in the air had changed. Later that night, a guard wrote in his diary. "Breakfast went strangely. The Germans laughed. For a moment, it didn't sound like enemies, just men." The next morning, the mess line was longer than usual. A few prisoners were already smiling before they reached the kitchen. By the time breakfast was over, the guards had a problem. The Germans wanted seconds. "Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel." They'd marched through Africa, fought in the desert heat, lost friends, hope, and pride, and now, behind barbed wire, they discovered maple syrup. The contradiction tasted sweeter than any of them would admit. By June 1944 the rhythm of Camp Hereford had settled into something that looked, from a distance, like order. Reveille at 5:30. Roll call. Work detail to nearby farms. 3 meals by the book, the same caloric allotment issued to U.S. troops, the Geneva Convention printed and posted in the mess hall in 2 languages none of them pretended to forget. Officially, the numbers were large and impersonal, more than 370,000 German POWs held in the United States by 1944-45, dispersed to camps that catalogued everything from shoelaces to sermons. Unofficially, life organized itself around smaller facts: who had cigarettes, who could play the accordion, who smiled at the smell from the kitchen long before breakfast. Camp 31, Hereford, earned a reputation in the inspection logs: model discipline, agricultural work productive, morale stable. They didn't note the other line everyone knew: the Americans made breakfast like they were feeding a small town on Sunday. The first week after the pancakes, the mess hall changed. Men who had once stared straight ahead now craned their necks toward the serving window. A new trade appeared overnight: 2 lucky strikes for a second ladle of syrup, 3 for an extra flapjack slid quick to the side of the plate when no lieutenant watched. On the blackboard where shifts were listed, someone chalked a crooked maple leaf. No one erased it. In 1981, long after uniforms were moth-eaten and accents softened by years, a former prisoner named Friedrich Koch recorded a few pages of memory for a local historian in Bremen. "We joked about their soft food," he said. "But after a week, we started to look forward to breakfast. The smell of pancakes, it was like peace itself." He paused on the tape before adding, almost embarrassed, "We learned the word refill before we learned freedom." The kitchen crew learned faces before names. The tall blonde with the scar wanted syrup but never butter. The short mechanic from Cologne preferred coffee so strong it bit back. One lieutenant with spectacles folded his napkin precisely, then licked the last gold thread from his fork when he thought no one saw. Sergeant Tom Reynolds, sleeves rolled, ran the line like a conductor. "Keep it moving," he'd bark, and then, softer, "Easy there, it's hot." The orchestra, yes, they had one, rehearsed in a warehouse between laundry lines. Violins that had crossed the Atlantic in crates found themselves under Texas light, playing Strauss in the hour before evening count. A clarinet warmed scales while the kitchen rattled pans. Sometimes, when the steam rose sweet and heavy, the musicians drifted toward the smell as if it were a second melody. Even the guards admitted it: if you closed your eyes, you could forget the wire until the wind tapped it like a metronome. Discipline did not dissolve, it bent. Work crews rode out to irrigate fields and stack hay. Farmers learned quickly that hungry men work straighter when promised real coffee at dawn. The morning the syrup delivery was late, tempers were short on both sides of the fence. "You'd think we'd cancelled Christmas," Reynolds muttered, watching boots shuffle and eyes narrow. When the tins finally arrived, dented, sticky, salvation, a captain signed the log with an exhale he disguised as a cough. The Americans pretended surprise less and less. Men who had sworn never to speak across the counter now fumbled for English like it might buy them a second ladle. "Please" became common currency. "Good" arrived with a tentative thumbs up. In the ledger, an inspector wrote, "Relations cordial." He did not write what Reynolds told his diary that night: "They say they hate everything here. But they line up early for the one thing that tastes like morning instead of orders." There were moments that cut sharper than any joke. A wiry prisoner from Dusseldorf lifted his tray and, under his breath, called the food childish. 2 minutes later he was scraping the last syrup with his finger, eyes closed as if listening to a hymn. Another day a guard spotted a small barter, a wedding ring traded for cigarettes, then traded again for a stack that steamed in the cool of pre-dawn. The ring found its way back by noon, the pancakes did not. Peace seeped in at the edges, disguised as habit. A cook flipped with a flourish and a half-circle of men on both sides of the counter watched the arc like boys waiting for a trick to land. For 3 seconds there was no rank, no flag, only a question: will it fall right? And then the soft slap of batter on iron and a round of involuntary applause that embarrassed everyone who joined. Not all took comfort. Some officers kept themselves cold on purpose, refusing sweetness as if it were surrender. They ate eggs, dry, and stared at the far wall. Reynolds respected it in the way a man respects a line he doesn't need to cross. Still, he noticed one of those men, late one evening when the hall was empty, dipping a crust in the syrup pot and licking it fast, as though caught stealing light. Word spread beyond the mess hall. In the barracks, men who once traded desert stories now argued the merits of butter over margarine. A black market recipe appeared on a scrap of cardboard: flour ratios, a sketch of a whisk, a note in cramped German, "Nicht zu dun." A guard confiscated it and, after his shift, copied it down for himself before sending it to the burn barrel. "Soft food makes soft men," a visiting officer declared, watching with disapproval as a prisoner grinned through a mouthful. Reynolds didn't answer. He'd seen the same man swing a sledge all afternoon and never once slow down. Softness wasn't the word. Archives recorded the big things: convoy schedules, hospital admissions, sermons, escapes attempted and abandoned. The small things, the 2-second pause before the first bite, the way shoulders lowered when sugar hit blood, the quiet hum of harmony from the warehouse as forks tapped plates, those lived only in memory, and memory has its own stubborn file system. They said they hated America, Reynolds wrote after a month of mornings that all tasted similar. Yet every day they wait for the smell of pancakes. Sometimes I think peace doesn't arrive with signatures. Sometimes it begins in a kitchen. On a Thursday that felt like every other, a crate arrived with a stamp from Vermont. Someone in supply had a sense of humor or mercy. Inside, tucked between cans, a postcard: a farmhouse, red, snow piled against a fence. On the back, one sentence in neat script: "For your boys, whoever they are." No name. Reynolds propped the card near the cash register no one used and ladled syrup until his shoulder ached. Outside, the wire hummed. Inside, men ate until the room smelled like a country none of them claimed and all of them missed. By supper, a rumor scraped along the bunks, the kind with too much detail to be invented. The Germans weren't the only ones who could adapt to sweetness. One of their own, a compact corporal with baker's hands, had been seen at the prep table that afternoon, eyes narrowed, measuring by feel. The cooks had let him try a flip. It landed clean. And that night, long after lights out, someone whispered a request through the slats between bunks that traveled farther than any order: "Tomorrow, could we learn how to make them?" The guards laughed it off when they heard. But Reynolds didn't. He was already counting out the flour. A few weeks later, one of the prisoners asked for a favor. He wanted to learn how to make them, the pancakes. It happened on a Tuesday morning in August 1944, when the air was so dry that even the flies seemed tired. Sergeant Tom Reynolds was hauling a bag of flour across the kitchen when he heard a hesitant voice behind him. "Excuse me, Sergeant." He turned. It was the short, square-shouldered German he'd seen lingering near the stove lately, mid-30s, sunburnt, hair trimmed military neat despite the heat. His English was careful, but clear enough. I was, baker. Before war. Dusseldorf. I can help, maybe. Reynolds squinted. Help with what? The man pointed at the griddle, then at the bowl of batter. Pancakes. For a moment, the kitchen froze. 2 American cooks snorted behind him. One muttered, "Sure, next he'll want the recipe for apple pie." But Reynolds waved them off. "Fine," he said, handing over a ladle. "Show me what you got, baker." The German introduced himself, Heinrich Müller, Corporal, Afrika Korps. He moved like someone who'd memorized the rhythm of work long before he ever wore a uniform. Without a word, he tested the griddle's heat with a drop of batter, then adjusted the flame slightly. "Too hot," he said, glancing up. "Burns outside, raw inside." Reynolds folded his arms. "You sound like my grandmother." Muller smiled, just a flicker, and poured the next round. The batter hissed, golden edges forming instantly. He waited, then flipped the first one with a sharp wrist motion. It landed perfectly, steaming and even. The other cook stopped laughing. "Not bad," Reynolds admitted. Muller nodded, half proud, half awkward. "Maybe little less syrup," he suggested, wrinkling his nose. "Too sweet." "That's the point," Reynolds said. The German tilted his head. "Point?" Reynolds hesitated, then shrugged. "It's breakfast. You're supposed to forget for a minute where you are." Muller didn't answer. He just kept cooking. The sound of batter meeting iron filled the silence, a soft hiss, a flip, a sigh. Within days, the others started showing up at the kitchen windows. Some came out of curiosity, others for the smell. By the third morning, 10 men were standing in a quiet semicircle, watching the corporal and the sergeant work side by side. They didn't talk much. Sometimes Muller would mutter a word in German, Mehl for flour, Milch for milk, and Reynolds would repeat it back in English until they both laughed at the mismatched accents. Once, Muller turned the tables. "How you say, peace?" he asked, holding up a finger as though balancing the word. "Peace," Reynolds said softly. Muller nodded. "In German, Frieden." Reynolds repeated it, awkward but sincere. The 2 men shared more silences than sentences, but each morning the distance between them shortened. When Reynolds forgot his lighter, Muller flicked a match for him without a word. When Muller's ladle broke, Reynolds carved a new handle from scrap wood and left it on his bunk. One evening, after roll call, the prisoners gathered near the mess hall to taste the new batch, thinner, crisp around the edges, less syrup, more butter. No one complained. A few even clapped when the corporal flipped one high enough to hit the beam and caught it clean. That night, in Barrack 7, someone whispered, "The German learned how to make American pancakes." No one laughed. Reynolds wrote in his notebook that evening, "Strangest day yet. A man I was told to hate reminded me of home. Same hands that aimed a rifle now hold a ladle steadier than mine." But not everyone shared his sense of wonder. The next morning, Captain Morgan called him in. The officer laid a report on the desk, typed, crisp, official. "You've been allowing prisoners into the kitchen?" Reynolds nodded. "Supervised, yes. Helps keep order." "Order?" Morgan leaned forward. "They're the enemy, Sergeant. Not your co-workers." Reynolds met his stare. "With respect, sir, they're not fighting anyone now." The captain sighed, tapping the paper. "Fine. But keep your distance. This is still a camp, not a bakery." When Reynolds returned to the kitchen, Muller was already there, sleeves rolled, waiting. He looked up when the door swung open. "All good?" he asked carefully. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He just tossed him the ladle. "Let's make breakfast." Outside, dawn crept over the flat Texas plain. The guards yawned, the prisoners lined up, the griddle hissed. Steam curled into the air, carrying the smell of flour, eggs, and something more fragile, trust, maybe, still too new to name. Later, a guard passing by the open door stopped and watched. "You see that?" he whispered. "The kraut and the cook, flipping pancakes like brothers." His partner shrugged. "Maybe the war's ending early in there." Inside, Reynolds and Muller worked in unison, saying little. Each flip landed clean, each plate left the counter a little faster than before. And in the faint morning light, two enemies, one from Texas, one from Dusseldorf, cooked side by side as if the world outside had already learned how to forgive itself. They called it Sunday breakfast. Not because it was Sunday, but because, for 1 hour a week, it felt like home. The name began as a joke whispered in Baroque 12, then spread like the smell of coffee. By autumn 1944, Camp Hereford in Texas moved with mechanical precision, reveille at dawn, roll call, work details to beat fields. The same dust, the same fences, the same endless horizon. But every seventh morning, the air inside the mess hall changed. The griddle hissed before sunrise. Butter melted in patient circles. The first whiff of maple syrup drifted over the compound, and even the guards breathed slower. Inside, German prisoners lined up shoulder to shoulder with Americans, cooks, farmers, soldiers, and men who had forgotten which category they belonged to. Sergeant Tom Reynolds ran the kitchen with his usual dry humor. He let the prisoners help now, though it wasn't in any manual. One private muttered, "You trust the krauts with knives." Reynolds didn't look up. "They're better with spatulas now." No one argued. By then, Heinrich Muller had become the unofficial assistant cook. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man who knew the language of kitchens long before the language of war. He didn't smile much, but his hands worked with quiet grace, a flip here, a scrape there, and the sound of batter meeting iron became the heartbeat of the camp. Soon, others joined him. The Sunday breakfast turned into something like a class. Flour, eggs, milk, ingredients measured by feel and memory. Muller would murmur, "Nicht zu dun, not too thin," and Reynolds repeated it back in his thick Texas accent, earning laughter from both sides of the counter. When a pancake landed perfectly, the room erupted into applause. The first time it happened, everyone froze, as if realizing they'd broken an unspoken rule, then kept clapping anyway. "Guess we're all civilians for an hour," Reynolds said softly. Within weeks, the routine took on ritual. Prisoners began trading drawings or songs for extra helpings. A guard with a harmonica played during cleanup. An Italian POW chalked a maple leaf on the mess hall board, and nobody erased it. Even the stern camp commander admitted, if peace had a smell, it'd probably smell like this. The Germans nicknamed Reynolds, Sir Pancake. It started as a joke, but they said it with a strange affection. One day, Muller slipped and called him, Herr Pancakchen. Reynolds only smiled. "I'll take that as a promotion. But sweetness is fragile." On the last Sunday of October, while they flipped the morning's first batch, the hum of engines rolled over the camp, deep, steady, unfamiliar. Men looked up instinctively. Through the slats of the mess hall roof, they saw a formation of planes heading east. Someone whispered, "Evac from Europe," and silence spread faster than smoke. Reynolds paused with the ladle midair. Muller didn't speak, but his hands slowed. Both knew that wherever those planes were going, war still lived inside them. For a moment, the camp forgot the griddle. Forgotten, too, was the ritual of pretending the world outside didn't exist. Then Reynolds forced a breath, flipped the half-cooked pancake, and said quietly, "Keep going." The routine resumed, fragile, deliberate. The hiss of butter returned, the smell of syrup thickened, and conversation slowly filled the cracks between the sounds of metal and flame. By noon, Sunday breakfast was complete. The men lingered, unwilling to return to the ordinary rhythm of orders and silence. Muller wiped his hands, looked at Reynolds, and said in halting English, "This is good tradition." Reynolds nodded. "Yeah. Let's keep it." Outside, the Texas wind bent the barbed wire until it sang a faint metallic tune. Inside, the camp exhaled as one. For an hour, enemies had eaten together, laughed together, shared something simple enough to make the world feel less cruel. Then the messenger arrived. A young private, barely 20, stood in the doorway, holding an envelope against his chest like it was burning. "Sergeant Reynolds." Reynolds turned, still holding a spatula slick with syrup. "Yeah." "Telegram, sir. From Fort Sam Houston." The room didn't stop right away. Muller was still plating the last pancakes, humming a tune that had no words. The prisoners kept eating, unaware. But Reynolds already knew, he didn't need to read it to feel the weight in that folded paper. He wiped his hands, took the envelope, and stepped outside. The sunlight hit hard, merciless, flattening color into dust and heat. He opened the telegram slowly. The words were short, official, printed in black that never faded. "Regret to inform you, your brother, Private First Class William Reynolds, killed in action, Belgium, October 27th. He read it twice, then folded it once, cleanly, like a recipe he already knew by heart. Behind him, the mess hall carried on. The smell of syrup drifted out, heavy and warm, clinging to his uniform. It didn't belong to war, or peace, or anything that could fit inside a telegram. For a long time, he stood in the yard, the wind tugging at his sleeves, the sound of laughter faint behind him. Inside, Muller flipped another pancake. Outside, Reynolds whispered to no one, he never even tasted M. And somewhere between those two silences, one in grief, one in work, the world kept turning. The next morning, Tom didn't come to the kitchen. The griddle stayed cold, the batter bowl empty, the light switch untouched. Word moved through the yard the way wind moves wheat, not fast, but total. By roll call the prisoners knew what the envelope had said, Belgium, October 27th, regret, official. Men who had no English for sorrow kept their eyes on the dust. On the prep table, under a coffee mug, lay a single envelope addressed in careful block letters. Sergeant Thomas Reynolds. Inside was a sheet of lined paper, written first in German and then again below in shaky English, each sentence mirrored as if to steady itself. Sehr geehrter Sergeant. We are sorry for your brother. My brother died in Stalingrad. Maybe they are friends now, somewhere. We learned from you that pancakes can be made with patience. Today we will make them for you, if allowed. Heinrich Muller, Corporal, Dusseldorf. There was no signature flourish, just a small greased thumbprint where the paper had been folded. Another sheet was tucked behind it, a clipping copied by hand, American Red Cross War Prisoners Commission, 1946, several camps reported condolence letters exchanged between prisoners and staff. Muller had underlined condolence twice, as if the word itself needed help crossing borders. Tom read it alone at the end of the barracks, the telegram folded once inside his breast pocket like a hot coin. He sat there until past 7, watching the light drag itself up the wall. When he finally stood, he didn't button his collar. He walked to the mess hall with his sleeves still rolled from yesterday, like time had decided to pause for him and refused. He expected noise and didn't find it. The kitchen was already full, but quiet, Germans in aprons, faces set, hands moving with a gentle urgency that had nothing to do with orders. A pot of coffee steamed. The griddle was warm, not blazing, a ladle rested on a clean towel. When Tom stepped through the door, no one saluted, no one spoke. Muller looked up, nodded once, and pointed to a plate set aside at the far end of the counter. On the plate, 3 pancakes stacked neat, butter melting slow. Across the top, a stripe of syrup laid with a steady hand, a simple cross. No speech. No performance. Just sweetness drawn into the shape of grief. Tom stood very still. Then he sat, fork in hand, and ate without tasting, and tasted without knowing how. Around him, batter hissed softly, the sound like rain that had finally found a roof. When he finished, he cleared his throat. All right, he said, voice rough as burlap. Make breakfast. He stepped back from the line. For the first time, he didn't lead, he watched. Muller took command with the economy of a man who understood what mercy looked like in a kitchen. Nicht zu viel, he told a younger prisoner at the syrup pot, not too much. Geduld, to the one who flipped too early, patience. An American private moved to help. Muller handed him a towel and included him in the choreography. Somewhere in the middle of it, the old guard with the harmonica began a hymn he didn't remember the words to, and it didn't matter, the tune did the work. Tom drifted along the counter like a ghost and quietly corrected a flame, then stopped himself and put his hands in his pockets. The pancakes came perfect and plain. No pecans, no vanilla, just flour, eggs, milk, heat, attention. One plate went to the officer's table, one to the infirmary, one to the dish boy who was always hungry. The room found a speed that did not jolt, a tone that did not rise. Near the end of the line, Muller slid a plate toward Tom again. "For your brother," he said carefully. "And for mine." He lifted his chin just enough to make the sentence stand upright. They ate standing, two men at the corner of a steel table. Tom tried to find a word that wasn't a thanks and wasn't an apology and discovered there wasn't one. He settled for a nod that felt heavier than his uniform. Muller matched it, as if nodding under the same weight. In his, later, memoir, a slim binder typed in 1958 and filed by a church historian in Dusseldorf, Muller would write, "That day, I realized we were not enemies. We were two men who had both lost brothers. The kitchen knew this before we did." A red stamp on the front page read "Private, not for publication." Time, stubborn, published it anyway. Tom returned the next morning and the one after. He didn't say much. The work moved around him like river water around a stone, finding its path without forcing it. He sharpened two knives and handed one to Muller, handle first. He fixed the hinge on the walk-in. He stood at the door during cleanup, arms crossed, eyes on the floor, listening to the small clatter that meant order and the soft hiss that meant enough. On Friday, he hung a slate at shoulder height, Sunday breakfast, prisoners to lead, supervised. Below it, in chalk, someone drew a tiny maple leaf and a tiny cross. No one erased either. The guards noticed the change. So did the men in the barracks. The jokes softened. The barter shifted from cigarettes to recipes. A recipe card, flour, eggs, milk, nicht zu dun, a drawn whisk, began circulating like contraband scripture. A lieutenant confiscated it, read it twice, then folded it into his breast pocket instead of the burn bin. On the fourth morning after the telegram, a storm rolled in from the panhandle, all wind and no rain. The wire sang. The mess hall windows rattled. Inside, the heat was steady and the smell was steady and the men were steady. Tom lifted his eyes once more, found Muller at the far griddle, and raised his hand in a small, tired salute. Muller returned it with the ladle. From that morning on, the kitchen smelled not like war, but like forgiveness. Christmas Eve, 1944. The wind came dry off the plains, carrying dust instead of snow. In the barracks, someone tuned a violin against the hum of the wire, another found the courage for a carol. The German voices started low, still knacked, and the hallways softened around them. A few American guards removed their helmets without thinking, as if the notes needed room to move. In the kitchen, the griddles were already warm. Reynolds had posted the slate at noon, Christmas supper, simple menu. Beneath it, someone added in chalk, pancakes. No one erased it. By evening, the mess hall smelled like butter and flour and the faint ghost of vanilla saved for rare days. Heinrich Muller arrived early, hair combed, sleeves rolled, palms nicked with the tiny cuts of a working week. He checked the burners, adjusted the flame, then waited at parade rest until Reynolds nodded. "Let's begin," Tom said. They cooked together as if the hour had been rehearsed. Batter poured in calm circles. The first cakes browned without sticking, the sign of a good night. Muller used less syrup than usual, a choice that made the sweet last longer. A private from Abilene slipped pecans into one bowl, and Reynolds pretended not to see. The room decided to forgive him. The carols thickened. From the barracks, the orchestra answered with a borrowed harmonium, its waver fitting the hour. A guard with a rough tenor found, "O come, all ye faithful," and a prisoner under his breath supplied the Latin. Voices braided into something that did not ask about uniforms. Reynolds ladled, Muller flipped. The line stretched to the door, patient in a way hunger rarely is. When the first plate went out, applause rose and fell, embarrassed but honest. A captain at the back folded his arms, then unfolded them and said nothing. Halfway through the first hour, Muller approached with a plate and a steadied face. 3 cakes, not too thick, butter softened, a narrow cross of syrup drawn as straight as a pencil line. He handed it to Tom like an offering he was afraid to spill. "For your brother," he said in careful English. "And for mine." The room went quiet long enough to hear the syrup run. Then someone near the door clapped once, hesitant. Others followed. It became a small thunder that stopped before it could turn into a cheer. Reynolds swallowed. The right words did not exist. He bowed his head, once for Belgium, once for Stalingrad, and ate as if eating were a kind of agreement. After that, the service found a rhythm that never broke. Trays moved like tides. Plates came back clean. When a cake tore, a second appeared in its place before anyone could apologize. A young guard, new, fidgeting, misjudged a flip and watched his failure slide to the floor. Muller placed a fresh one on his plate without comment, then handed him the spatula again. The second attempt landed true. The grin was small and private. At the far table, an older officer scribbled in a leather notebook. Later, his report would read, "Unusual morale uplift observed. No disciplinary issues for 72 hours following event." The words were flat, the result not. Men who had not slept well since Africa slept that night. Near midnight, the kitchen door opened to a draft and a pair of civilians from town, the chaplain and a woman from the Red Cross. They set down a tin of hard candy, said grace in 2 languages, and stayed to dry plates. The chaplain listened to the carols and wiped his eyes with a sleeve he pretended was dusty. "Keep going," he told Reynolds. "This is the sermon they'll remember." Someone from the local weekly took notes the next day, printing a 3-inch column 2 issues later, "Christmas supper shared at Camp 31, German prisoners and guards take holiday together." No names, just the melody of the night captured in print, pancakes, carols, no fights. By last call, there was flour on boot tips and a pale fog on the windows. The pecans ran out, the batter held. Muller leaned an elbow against the steel table, listening to a melody he recognized from before uniforms. Reynolds stacked pans, knuckles raw, and let the sound run through the ache. For an hour, the world had obeyed a different set of rules. Cleanup became its own ritual. Germans scrubbed griddles under American supervision, American stacked plates washed by German hands. The motion felt like a treaty signed in soap and heat. A boy from Bremen and a boy from Brownsville argued quietly over which cloth dried glass faster, then laughed at themselves for caring. When the last pan was hung and the burners cooled, the 2 men stood by the back door where the wind could find them. The sky above the flats was black and lit far off with prairie stars. Somewhere, coyotes argued with the idea of silence. "They will move us, after winter," Muller said, searching for words. "Another camp, another place." Reynolds nodded. Transfers were already on the board in pencil. "War's a long road," he said. Muller held out a folded scrap, a recipe written in both hands. Ratios, a note, nicked zu dun / not too thin, and a penciled line at the bottom, "Someday, in peace." Reynolds folded it into his pocket like a document. They shook hands once, the barest pressure, callus to callus. The kitchen light clicked off behind them. In the officer's office, the report dried beside a telephone that would ring too often in the months ahead. In town, the paper said its small type. In the barracks, men slept with the sweetness still ghosting the air. At the fence, the wire hummed the indifferent note it always hummed. By spring, trucks came before dawn. Orders arrived, names, numbers, routes. Men climbed aboard with blankets folded tight. The griddle waited in a room that smelled faintly of the night it had made. Reynolds stood with his hands in his pockets and did not wave. When they said goodbye months later, no one spoke of the war. They only promised one thing, quietly, like a vow made to a stove rather than to a flag, that they would make pancakes again, someday, in peace. And somewhere in a city neither had seen, a small storefront would be rented, a menu chosen, a first batch poured. But that would be another season. For now, the trucks idled. The door to the mess hall swung once on its hinge and settled. In 1954, a small diner opened on the edge of Dusseldorf, white walls, 6 stools, a griddle that hissed like memory. The sign on the window read in English, American Breakfast. Beneath it, in smaller German letters, Pancakes, coffee, Eier. Inside stood Heinrich Müller, once a corporal, now a cook. He moved the way he always had in the camp kitchen, quiet, precise, every motion measured between heat and patience. The first customers came out of curiosity, men in gray coats, women with ration bags still folded from the war. They sat stiffly until the smell of butter and flour softened their shoulders. Müller poured the batter thin, let the edges crisp. When he flipped the first one, a boy at the counter gasped. A woman asked, Americanish? Müller smiled. Ja. Und Frieden. And peace. Within months, locals called it the Pancake Place. Reporters from the U.S. Information Service noted in trade reports that American breakfast cafes were appearing across West Germany, small pockets of sweetness in cities still half in ruin. In the Rhenish Post, a single line mentioned Müller's diner, former POW brings American pancakes to Dusseldorf. No story beyond that, but the city seemed to know. People came to taste something gentle. They left quieter. On the wall hung one photograph, a sunburned American in a flour-stained apron, holding a spatula like a flagpole. Below, in neat handwriting, für Tom, der mir gezeigt hat, wie Frieden schmeckt. For Tom, who showed me what peace tastes like. Some mornings, Müller wiped the frame and stood still, as if listening to a kitchen half a world away. Then he'd turn the sign to open and begin again, eggs, coffee, batter, patience. Across the Atlantic, in Kansas, Tom Reynolds read about the diner in a veteran circular, a short note buried between notices about reunions and obituaries. Ex-POW opens Pancake Cafe in Dusseldorf. He folded the paper twice and sat for a long time before writing a letter to the editor. They printed it whole. I still think about those breakfasts. We flipped cakes while waiting for the world to decide what to do next. Maybe the war didn't end in Berlin. Maybe it ended in a Texas kitchen when enemies shared the same plate and no one reached for a rifle. He signed only Tom Reynolds, Sergeant, U.S. Army. Back in Germany, the diner thrived quietly. American tourists stopped in, soldiers on leave left coins from their bases across Europe. A jar near the register read Syrup Fund. The money bought more butter, and once, train fare for an old campmate who came to visit. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. In the drawer below the counter lay a single folded recipe card, the paper yellowed at the creases. Flour, eggs, milk, nicht zu dünn / not too thin. At the bottom, in pencil, someday, in peace. Müller never showed it to customers, but he touched it sometimes before opening the shop, the way a man checks the pulse of an old wound that no longer hurts, only remembers. A young reporter once asked him why pancakes. Müller didn't look up from the griddle. Because you can't rush them, he said. You have to wait for the bubbles, then turn them at the right moment. That's how peace works, you wait, and you don't burn it. On slow afternoons, he'd make one extra cake, draw a thin cross of syrup, and set it beneath the photo. Steam rose, curling like a quiet prayer toward the smiling man in the frame. Sometimes the smallest kindness, a meal, a word, a little sweetness, does what treaties never could. They came as prisoners. They left as men who had learned the flavor of peace, maple, butter, and forgiveness.